class, so the seniors graduating this year in 21. And it really actually didn't come from the College Board. It came from all the individual campuses from their
Mm.
admissions office. So not everyone did it, but the majority of campuses either did what's called test optional, where students could choose to send in a test score if they had one,
Right.
or test blind, like the University of California system, meaning they won't look at a test score at all, even if you send it in. So
Wow.
most admissions offices made a call, last year, kind of in the spring, on what they were going to do for the current senior year class. But that being said, most schools in this past week, most of the Ivies kind of fell along the same lines too, where they
Mhm.
announced for the class of 22, so the current juniors, that they will also be test optional again next year. So
Okay,
some are
great
announcing it.
information.
Yeah, some are announcing it for a 3-year term. So this past year being year one, and then the next 2 years. But many, and that with Harvard and many of the Ivies announcing that last week, most likely all of the other schools are going to follow suit in the coming month and announce that for this year's or the current juniors for their application cycle.
Okay, so if I'm a junior golfer listening to this and I'm asking myself, oh, it's test optional. Do I really need to take the SAT? Do I really need to spend countless hours studying for it, preparing for it?
The kicker is that the NCAA has not announced this yet for initial eligibility. So that'll be the big one to keep an eye on, is if the NCAA announces that you do not need to submit a test score for initial eligibility, like they did with the current seniors, then I would truly say, yes, it is optional. So if we're just thinking from the admission side of things without the initial eligibility, I
Mhm.
do tell students that it really is optional. You will not be looked down on if you don't send in your test score. So usually what I tell students to do is look at the average range of test scores for that university, which you can usually find on a website like collegedata.com or something similar, and see where their test score ranges. So if the
Mhm.
ACT score for a certain school ranges between a 25 and a 28, and your test score falls within or above that, then you should send in your test score because it helps you and kind of makes your application that much stronger. If your test score falls below that, then don't send it in. But do know that admissions will then look more closely on your grades, on the courses you've taken, and the activities that you've done. So if your grades
Great
are
advice.
less strong or not as strong as your test score, then send in your test score.
Sure.
But I typically look at that 50% range and advise off of that.
So very interesting and great information there. I didn't hear anything in that you said it's probably not a good idea to take it, right? So are we still in this climate, regardless of grades, regardless of being a student athlete, do you think it's still very advantageous, very beneficial to sign up, to prepare and take the SAT or ACT?
I do. What I found is that I tell my students still to try practice and try really hard. Give it one, probably two tries. If it's not where you want it to be after two tries, then let it go and focus on other things. Focus on
Mm.
getting a good internship this summer or something like that. So yes, I mean, I think in past students felt like they had to really, spend a ton of extra money and maybe test, 3, 4, 5 times to get the score they need. And I'm finding I'm telling students if it doesn't happen after your first two, attempts, assuming that you've actually practiced before those first two attempts,
Sure. Exactly, right.
just let it go and focus on the other parts of your application. So it's nice because I think it gives the students a little bit more power and more options.
Okay. So how long have you been doing this, Kelly?
I've been in the world of higher ed for like 14 years, but been doing
14 years.
my
Have you, sorry to interrupt, but have you ever seen anything like this where we've gone test optional across the board?
So, not across the board. The test optional movement has been a really big thing over the last 5 to 10 years. And truthfully, I think the COVID just sped it up. So there
Mm.
was already a number of schools that had moved that way, and other schools wanting to, but not really having the right reason or enough data to do it. And so I do think that the fact that so many tests were canceled and students didn't have access to it forced schools to go test optional.
Mm.
And many are doing it for another few years to gather data on it to see if they're still getting strong applicants and enough applicants. And the initial data off year one is that most schools that went test optional had an increase in applications. So I see
Oh,
it
wow.
being something that'll be here to stay. And
Yeah,
what the
interesting.
NCAA does will be really interesting because that's
Now,
really going to be the kicker for
I,
athletes.
I've been waiting to pick your brain on this as well. I heard that they also did away with the subject tests
Yes.
and the essay or
Yes.
the writing portion.
Yep.
How does that affect the Ivy League differently than most schools? Does that affect um, how does that affect most missions departments? If that's a general question that you could
Yeah.
answer.
I think again, like requiring the essay on the SAT or the ACT was something that schools did, 5, 6 years ago and have really
Hmm.
done away with over the last 5 years.
Hmm.
Some students still take it and submit it, but I think if you talk to admissions, they'll tell you that the score doesn't really have much meaning to them. It doesn't really, it doesn't show in data that it correlates with any sort of success in college. So
Hmm.
I don't think I don't think that piece will change much other than the fact that students have one less thing to worry about when taking the test.
Right.
So I would definitely advise if you're signing up for the SAT no longer has the essay, but if you're signing up for the ACT, sign up without the essay because it's not really worth the extra time.
Great
Um,
advice.
so that piece, yeah, I think it'll be interesting. The subject tests were kind of something that students just did for more Ivy or highly selective schools. So I don't see that changing most people's strategy. But what it does is I think, so students might be more inclined to take more AP tests or exams to show strength in a certain subject. So if you're more like a high academic student and you're looking to show that you have strength in a certain area, that's the way I would recommend doing it now instead of taking the SAT subject test. Because you're right,
Awesome.
as of March, so next month they're gone.
Wow. Yeah. And the subject tests to me were a bit of a mystery anyway. Never took them.
Yeah.
Never really learned too much about them. So you're saying not only were we headed that way anyway,
Mhm.
the essays were kind of being pushed to the curb, and now with the Ivies and some of the higher academics, they're just going to look for things other than the subject. Obviously, things that complement your application, things that complement you applying to that school versus having that subject test in the past. Is that right?
Yeah. Yep, I've seen most students that took the subject test typically were students in like math or sciences that wanted to show their strength in that area.
Mm.
And I think, yeah, another way of going about it is taking an AP course if it's offered at your school, or if you've maxed out the number of math courses at your school, taking one at a local college and pushing yourself higher in that area, or finding outside experiences to put on your college application or resume. So, yeah, I
Awesome
think
advice.
only a handful of schools were requiring them anyway, so it was really just an optional add-on for most students.
Okay. So wow, this is interesting because I'm as an outsider, I'm kind of just thinking these are big hammer drops, right? As we're going, but we were really headed in that direction all along.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
super
and
interesting.
I think hopefully that it will make it easier for the student. Now there used to be so many options of should I do it, should I not? And now
Yeah.
knowing that they don't exist, you kind of realize that it wasn't that big a deal anyway. So just
Right.
focus on the SAT or the ACT, do well, and focus on taking challenging courses as you go throughout your high school.
Awesome. Okay, so I talked a little bit about a second ago how the landscape of the athletic side of things, specifically college golf, is changing. How, since coronavirus hit and the pandemic era, has taken course, how has admissions changed? And I don't know if that's too much of a blanket question. There's a vast array of schools out there and a vast array of things that you need for admission. But how has coronavirus changed, I guess, generally speaking? And then if you don't mind, could you go into one or two specifics of how it's changed at certain levels?
Mhm. Yeah, good question. I think, in general, some schools used to be more focused on just numbers. So test scores and GPA. And I think this past spring, when students weren't able to test and many high schools went pass fail, it kind of forced admissions this next year to look a little bit more beyond just the numbers. So, what classes did students take to challenge themselves? What
Hmm.
did they do outside of the classroom, to learn more about their interest or gain more experience or just juggle responsibilities in general. So I think that piece has been helpful. Like admissions looks more holistically upon things. And then when things shut down, like how creative were students in finding ways to still learn more or get involved or things like that too. So yeah, I mean, I think that's one specific example, and therefore admissions looks a little bit more at the classes you take and the activities that you do. But also too, I've kind of seen the same thing in the essays that were asked in this last admission cycle. Many colleges, kind of with the Black Lives Matter movement and all of that, asked a lot of questions about what students did to make a difference in their community or to be an activist for change. So I think a lot of schools were looking for students that want to make a difference or get involved on one way or another.
Yeah.
There's no
How are
one
you
way
making an
to do that.
influence,
Mhm.
sort of thing? Interesting.
Yeah, yep. And I always tell student athletes too, I mean, I know you're busy with your sport, but even if your team goes and can go and do something together, or if you as an individual can use your platform and following on social media or something to influence for the good, those are all things that you can reflect on as you think about putting your admissions
I,
packet together.
I got a nerdy golf analogy I'm going to use. My strength in my game is putting, and I know all the junior golfers out there can probably relate to this. If you have a bad putting day, right, you have to rely on hitting it closer. Whether it's with your wedges, whether it's with your bunker game, whether it's with, even off the tee, hitting it a little bit straighter to put you in a better position. And I think the same is true from what you just said. We can't rely on these other things anymore, as much as we used to, at least in the admissions process. So we have to show that we have a community involvement, that we have these other avenues to really
Mhm.
enhance our application and showcase ourselves. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, control what you can control, and yeah, absolutely. Do what you can to build up
Well, I
your.
think I'd be crazy not to say this. I think there's a lot of people out there that just think it's SAT, GPA, and that's it, right?
Yeah.
And that's all I need to apply to a school and realistically get in. And that's, I think, what we're learning here today is that's totally not the case. And there's so many other ways that
Mhm.
not only you could be showcasing yourself, but you should be
Right.
showcasing yourself,
Absolutely. And not
especially
to
during
say,
this time.
yeah, and not to say like if you have a very strong GPA and test score and you're applying to a school that's, good, but not,
Sure,
excellent, then you're probably going to get in regardless of the rest of your application. But yes, I
sure.
mean, knowing that most students apply to schools that kind of fit with where their numbers are, you have to do something else to stand out.
So Kelly, if some of the athletes out there in their senior year that have already applied to schools, and many times in our case, we're not only applying to 2 or 3 schools, we're applying to 10 schools. What are, in your own opinion, in your advice, what are some good ways to stay on top of that, and what are some things that we can look for?
Yeah. Yeah, I think for the current seniors, there are still schools accepting applications. So if a coach or something comes up, you can always, look and see what their rolling admission deadline is and still apply to many schools. Some deadlines have passed either February 1st or March 1st. So just keep an eye on those that have firm deadlines, and some have rolling admissions if they're still accepting applications. But then after that, once you've applied to all of your schools, it's really important to make sure you check your email and go back in and create student accounts at each of these universities. So even though the Common App, if you use that, might help you send applications to 10 different schools, super easy fashion through that one portal. Once you do it, you have to go in and create an individual student account on each of the universities that you've applied to. And the reason you want to do this, there's kind of two main things. First of all, you'll be able to go in and check your application status and see if they've received all of the materials needed. So this is
Hmm.
usually your transcript, a high school recommendation or an other recommendation, obviously your application, and then your fee. So they usually track all of these pieces. And even if you're admissible, but you're missing a transcript, you won't be admitted if it's not in there. So it's definitely an important piece of the puzzle to make sure they have all of your materials. And then beyond that, that's usually where they're going to first post your admissions decision. So
Hmm.
as schools roll out admissions decisions this winter, you can go back in. Usually you'll be prompted with an email, but you can go back in and check in your student portal and see if you've been admitted or not.
Mm-hmm.
And then the final piece of this is once you do decide on your school, that student portal is where you'll initially make your enrollment deposit. So one important thing to note is that you can only make an enrollment deposit at one school. So even though all of schools that you've been admitted to will ask you to make an enrollment deposit, know that you don't do this until you decide on your final choice and make a
Sure.
deposit on one school only.
Okay, that's excellent. And I've gotten this question a lot, so I wanted to pose this to you. When we talk about admissions decisions, is that typically a very certain date, or is that a wide array of dates, or does it depend on the school?
Yeah, it depends on the school. Some will get back to you right away. Schools that are more not as holistic as we talked about before, maybe more numbers based. So like here in the Midwest where I am, Iowa's like that. University of Iowa usually will get back to you in a week or two because they're very
Oh
kind
wow.
of high on it's you meet a certain GPA and test score and you're in. So
Hmm.
you'll hear back quickly. Other schools that review them more holistically usually take months to review. So those schools you usually don't hear back from anywhere from December through usually mid-March. The final enrollment deposit deadline for all schools across the US is May 1st. So most likely by mid-March, you will have heard from all of your schools unless you recently submitted one on a rolling application deadline. But yeah, I mean, so sometime this winter or spring you will hear, and then you have to usually make your final decision by May 1st. Obviously, athletics can have a little bit of leeway sometimes, but that's sort of the national deadline.
Sure. And we hope most of my guys, and for their sake, are committed and signed before that date. So
Yes.
we should have most of that figured out.
Yep,
Okay.
absolutely.
Is there, tagging on to that question, is there any insider info or any link or any place that we can find out whether a college is, very basic like in Iowa, or more complex? I imagine some of the higher academics, probably smaller schools,
Mhm.
typically have the more ability because they're letting less students in. They can actually sit down and review them
Right.
as a team. Is that right? Am I thinking of that right way?
Yep. Yeah, I think, and like even so, where I work part-time at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, even as a huge state school, they still review holistically,
Oh
but it
wow.
does take a while to get back to students. So
Hmm.
students that apply by November 1st, early action, will not hear back till the end of December. And students that don't kind of hit that final deadline of March 1st won't hear back till the end of, mid-April usually.
Wow.
So it does take a few months after the final deadline to hear the decision.
That's a lot of applications to review, and a lot of
Yeah,
work, I can imagine.
yeah, they have a big team, but yeah, and I would love to say that there's one website where you can check this all, but really it's probably just the admissions page at each university will typically give you an idea of when you should hear back.
Okay, excellent. Definitely have my guys look into that. So Kelly, as we finish this up here, I have one last question to ask. There's one major mistake that you see over and over and over again in the admissions process. And you see families making it, student athletes making it maybe, or just your general, you know, undergraduate, prospective undergraduate freshmen. What would that mistake be?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, yeah, it really depends on the student. I mean, I think you could go two ways. I mean, I think probably starting too late is the biggest general the biggest one I can throw out there in general. So I think a number of students that I haven't connected with that maybe are just kind of trying to navigate it on their own and really don't
Mhm.
start until they kick off their senior year feel like they're really behind. And then
Yeah.
they feel like senior year is a stress and a
And they're
scramble.
really stressed when you don't want it to be, right?
No, and really you should, like you can as juniors right now begin working on most of your application parts. The college specific essays don't come out until August 1st, but there's a lot you can be doing now. You can be taking your ACT and SAT, you can be working on the Common App already, you can start your personal statement essay anytime this spring or summer. So if you can, kind of devote some time into your junior year or summer between junior and senior year to tackling some of that, it'll make the fall of your senior year much more enjoyable.